to this Festival of Ideas event, the City of York's coat of arms, Hidden Stories. My name is Laura Yeoman. I'm an archivist with the Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York, and it is my pleasure to be chairing this session this afternoon. If I look slightly knackered, it's my second session back to back. But at least we're going to have Gillian giving us a presentation this morning. So this is an event delivered by Gillian Waters in partnership with the Centre for Lifelong Learning at the University of York. Gillian trained as a medievalist and has been teaching and researching history for over 25 years. She's worked in the Royal Armouries in Leeds, the Mansion House in York, the Council for British Archaeology, and many other local Yorkshire museums and archives on a consultancy basis, creating resources, developing courses, and organising activities for learners of all ages. Gillian teaches history and heritage courses at the University of York's Centre for Lifelong Learning, and also works with Washburn Heritage Centre and Museum Development Yorkshire. Today, Gillian's going to explore the stories behind the city's coat of arms and give us more information about York as well. So Gillian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
That's brilliant, lovely. So yeah, the York City coat of arms, which I think is a little gem and tells us a lot about the secret history, if you like, of the city of York. So that's why we entitled this Hidden Stories. Because the coat of arms really, I think, is a story of rebellion, a story of perhaps we were in York once going to be the city of, or the capital of the whole of England, certainly in the early 1300s. And it's also a story of Richard II as well. And when we look at the coat of arms, we can see that we've actually got 5 different components here. We do have, obviously, the cross of St George now, which is a red cross on a white background. And we also have the 5 lions of York, which are a little bit of a mystery. But I would argue, as you will see later on, I would argue that the 5 lions are actually a signifier that at one time Edward III wanted York to be the capital of England before he got distracted by the 100 Years' War. But we'll come into that a little later on. So we've got the cross of St George and the 5 lions are actually the coat of arms of the city of York, which is why I've got a little sort of blue colour around these little boxes. Whereas the cap of maintenance, the mace and the sword are the insignia and symbols of the corporation of the city of York, otherwise known today as the Council of the City of York. And that is why you see them on buses, see them everywhere, this symbol of the City of York Council. So where to start in looking at this? Well, the first real evidence we have on the cross of St George and the 5 lions is this seal of the City of York. It's actually got in Latin around it. It actually has Latin saying it's a sigillum secretum officii majoris civitantis eberarchi. In other words, a privy seal of the office of the mayor of the citizens of York. This is the mayoral seal. So this is evidence we have that this was a coat of arms, if you like, the City of York had adopted. Certainly, it's recorded in the heraldic visitations 1584 of the county of Yorkshire for the very first time. With this drawing, which is where I've taken this illustration from, you'll notice that on either side it has the you've actually got the ostrich feathers of the Prince of Wales, and you've got a little coronet at the top. And this seal was certainly used from 1420s up until 1959 by the morality of the City of York to seal their documents. And we also have in the heraldic visitation of York a little bit that tells us something about the evidences that the Herald, Somerset Herald, Robert Glover, actually looked at to justify why he was including this coat of arms. And he tells us that the noble city of York hath been privileged by the kings of this realm most anciently, and the same privileges from time to time hath been enlarged, since King Henry II, who confirmed all former grants made in the time of King Henry I, his grandad, as in all the times before that, as appeareth by an ancient register containing the transcript and copies of the same charters, showed unto me, Somerset, in the time of this visitation and survey, when Mr. Andrew True, Esquire, was Lord Mayor of the same city. In other words, Somerset is telling us that there's lots of old charters that prove this coat of arms. And the other really interesting section is he says that it appeareth by an ancient register, and also talks about in all the times before that. In other words, he's intimating that the city of York had a coat of arms going back really almost to the time of William the Conqueror, and in fact perhaps went a little further back. Now, we know that coats of arms really are not used until the 13th century, so it's a little bit of, it's inaccurate, should we say that, but there is this suggestion that it's a really ancient coat of arms. Now, the cross of St. George was used really by the kings of England from the early 1300s as a symbol, a signifier, as the national saint of England. But before that, in the Crusades, they wore white crosses and red crosses on their surcoats when they were going off on the Crusades. And you can see this knight on the right-hand side, he's not got a red cross on a white background, he's got a white cross on a red background. And certainly in the 1180s, when Henry II decides he's going off on a crusade, never does, but he promises to, with the King of France, he agrees that his knights will wear a white cross on a red background, and the French king will have knights wearing a red cross on a white background. So we've got then this idea of white crosses being used as symbols and signifiers in the Crusades. So when does the Cross of St. George become adopted as our national flag, our national saint? That's really down to Edward III, who certainly by the 1330s has adopted the Cross of St. George not only as the national saint of England, and he also has flags made, that standards, banners, pennants, all sorts, by the late 1330s. But he also, after the Battle of Crecy, which you can see on the right there, and I love this image, because not only do we have the three lions of England, we also have these knights wearing these glorious pig-faced bassinets, which I love, and nice pointy noses that they would have, which was all fashionable at the time. Now, after the Battle of Crecy in 1346, Edward III decides to set up the Garter, the Order of the Garter of the Knights of St. George, really to commemorate that victory. And he has 26 knights, basically 2 tournament teams of 13, which is what he established. His original intention was to actually build a big round tower at Windsor to hold 300 knights seated around a big wooden table, a bit like King Arthur's knights at the Round Table. But he ran out of money with his wars in France, and he had to make do with a smaller chivalric order of 26 knights. And that exists, of course, to today. Now, in 1337, he declared the 100 Years' War, or started the 100 Years' War with France. And before that, he'd been fighting against the Scots, and York was actually his capital. Really, the advance point from which he could get his troops up into Scotland. And it's 100 Years' War that made him refocus and move his capital from York, because we had the Exchequer, we had in Clifford's Tower, he had his chancellery there as well in the 1330s, but when he decided to fight against the French in the 100 Years' War, his capital had to move further south. So really, in 1337, York could be seen as the capital of England. And the evidence that we have of the coat of arms of York, you can see here the cross of St George with the 5 lions on Micklegate, and the coat of arms that Edward III adopted, which is the fleur-de-lis and the 3 lions of England, on Micklegate, certainly there by 1375. And some would have it that the 5 lions and the cross of St George were adopted by the city in the 1300s. But I think there's a case for it being slightly earlier. I thought you might like to see this lovely image of William the Conqueror sitting on a horse looking very fine in his 13th century armour. It's later, it's not contemporary, with the 3 lions of England, which you probably know were adopted by Richard I in the late 1100s. And he's also wearing a lovely surcoat as well, and a little short shield in which he can display his arms. What I particularly like about this image is the boiled leather kneecaps he's wearing. These was made of boiled leather, or cuir-de-lis, which is boiled not in water but in oil. And it's really tough stuff and could be an armour. And what you'll notice is quite a lot of his mates have adopted this boiled leather kneecaps as well on their armour. Now, William the Conqueror, of course, conquered England in 1066. Well, it's a bit of a fallacy. He had a bit of a battle at Hastings in 1066. Also, Stamford Bridge and Fulford, as you probably know, were fought battles there before he landed. And he then had to conquer the rest of England. Now, in the north, we rebelled 1067, 1068, 3 times in 1069. And after our last rebellion in the north of England, William the Conqueror decided he would punish the north, and he harried the north with his soldiers. What that meant was he burnt crops, killed livestock, terrified and killed many of the inhabitants of the north, which did actually mean, according to one chronicler, that 100,000 people died in the north, and that people could not be buried either. People starved. It said 3 generations of people starved in the north, and it was a wasteland, allegedly. Now, one of the earliest historians of the city of York, Francis Drake, actually tells a story about the rebellion of 1069, which is a little garbled but gives us some clues as to the origin of the cross of St George and the 5 lions. And he tells us that the arms of the city of York at that time was argent, a cross gules, in other words, St George's cross, red cross on a white background. The conqueror charged the cross with 5 lions, passant garde en haut, in memory of the 5 worthy captains magistrates who governed the city so well that he afterwards made Sir Robert Clifford governor, and the other 4 to aid him in council. And the better to keep the city in obedience, he built 2 castles and double-moated them about. In other words, what Francis Drake is telling us here is that William the Conqueror is fighting. He's fighting Anglo-Saxons in the north of England, and yet Francis Drake has him fighting Robert Clifford, who's obviously a Norman. He also tells us that Sir Robert Clifford, who was governor, was so far from being blamed by the Conqueror for his stout defence that he was highly esteemed and rewarded for his valour, being created Lord Clifford and then knighted, with 4 magistrates then in office: Harrogate, Talbot, who came after to be Lord Talbot, Lascelles and Erringham. Now, what we've got here is a bit of a garbled story. We've got a garbled story from Francis Drake, who is confusing what happened in 1069 when the city of York was harried by William and his men with the events of the 13th century. Because the people that he names, Harrogate, Talbot, Lascelles and Erringham, are actually around in the 13th century. But what he tells us, in essence, is the cross of St George came first and the 5 lions later on. And when we look at what happens in the 13th century in York, I think he's got a point. Because in the 13th century, Simon de Montfort, a crusading knight, whose armies wore a white cross on a red background, which, as we've seen, is a crusading coat of arms, if you like, or certainly the symbol crusaders did wear. And Simon de Montfort led a rebellion, effectively, against the king Henry III. And in 1263, as I've just said, the troops of the rebel Simon de Montfort wore white crosses on their surcoats. Now, in June of that year, in the middle of this turmoil, as we've got supporters of Simon de Montfort and supporters of Henry III, Henry III ordered the mayor and citizens of the city of York to support a certain Robert Neville, keeper of the castle in York, against the rebels of Simon de Montfort, which leads us to think that in the city of York there may well have been... Is that a signal for us to evacuate? No? Okay. In the city of York there may well have been supporters of Simon de Montfort in order for the king to command the mayor and citizens to support his official in York Castle. And by July 1263, however, we've got one of Simon de Montfort's supporters in charge of Yorkshire as the Sheriff of Yorkshire, a certain Simon de Avil, or de Davil, who had a base over in Gargrave near Skipton, and also a bit further north from York as well. Now, John Davil is named Sheriff of Yorkshire by Simon de Montfort's Council of Magnates, because by this time Simon de Montfort had taken charge of England, basically, and he was effectively ruling on behalf of the king, but the king was not actually in charge of the country himself. So we've got John Davil is in charge. However, by December of that year, Henry III had regained control. John de Avil is dismissed. He's a bit peeved by this and very upset, and so he decides to attack York Castle and seize it and take it himself. And he also lays waste to the Abbey of St Mary's, the very land that we are on today. And he also attacks lands in Bootham and Marygate. And he continues this spoliation for quite some time, until in April 1264, he only finally leaves the city of York when the citizens of York cross his palms with £100. Now, that may sound like not a lot of money, but in today's money, that's £1,800,000. So that's a lot of brass. Again, by June 1264, Simon de Montfort defeats Henry III at the Battle of Lewes in Sussex. And this is particularly significant because it's after this Battle of Lewes that we get our first ever Parliament, at which knights of the Shire are called by Simon de Montfort to bolster his power base. So we've got really a power struggle between Simon de Montfort and Henry III. John de Avil is reinstated at the city of York, and he takes the castle as well for another year. Montfort is finally defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. And this is the end of the rebellion. But a year later, 3 years later, in 1268, Henry III visits the city of York. Simon de Montfort's supporters had had white crosses on red backgrounds. Henry III's army at the final Battle of Evesham in 1265 had red crosses on white backgrounds to distinguish themselves from the rebel forces. And I suggest to you that in 1268, when Henry III visited the city, it may have been at this time that the citizens of York decided to display a red cross on a white background as their heraldic achievement, if you like. Perhaps to show their loyalty to the King, Henry III, because some of their members, some citizens in York, had supported Simon de Montfort. So if not in 1268, when I think the city of York adopted the red cross on the white background, it is possible that they adopted it certainly by 1298, when Edward I moved his government to the city of York during the Scottish Wars. And if not then, certainly by the early 1300s. So I think Francis Drake is right, that the cross is adopted first, and then the 5 lions. And as I suggested earlier, the 5 lions, I think, are adopted as a symbol of favour of Edward III to the city that certainly in the 1330s he is intending to make his capital, but later moves it south, his capital south to London, because of the 100 Years' War. So far we've looked at the Cross of St George, which I think was adopted in the 1260s, certainly by the end of the 13th century by the city of York. Then the 5 lions, certainly I think adopted by 1337. And then we have the cap of maintenance, the mace and the sword of state. And really, we owe these 3 elements of the coat of arms to Richard II. And Richard II, as you can see here, looking very handsome, and he's got a little heart there, which was his symbol, his badge. Behind him we've got St Edmund the Martyr, who's holding the arrow that killed him in 869. We have here Edward the Confessor with the ring, the coronation ring, and John the Baptist. Really, this is a legend that Richard, he born on the 6th of January, and this legend that 3 kings came to visit him as he was being born, or just after he was born. And on the right, we've got the Virgin Mary. This is part of the Wilton diptych, a very famous image. And here you can see there's the Virgin Mary that Richard is praying to. And, of course, we have the flag of St George. So, Richard II, then, is a young king. He's 10 when he comes to the throne. He has a series of nobles helping him to govern, who actually want to take power and govern themselves. He's got the wars in France that aren't going very well, and he's really got a huge national debt. So there's a move to try and really pull back on government spending. And Richard II finds himself in 1386 in the Merciless Parliament of finding his household is purged, his favourites are executed, he's deprived of his closest counsellors. And he's a bit angry, because by 1387, he's nearly 20. he should be ruling by himself. And he goes on a progress to try and get support from the counties against what are known as the appellant lords, the opposition to him. And it is either on this visit in 87 or his next visit in 1389 to the city of York that he actually presents a sword to the city of York. Francis Drake uses both dates, 1387 and 1389. And he tells us that it was at this time that our own records speak. King Richard took the sword from his side and gave it to be borne before William de Selby, the first Lord Mayor of York. And of course, it is since this time that we talk not of mayors of the city of York, but Lord Mayors of the city of York. 1392, Richard II had a bit of argument with the City of London. He suspended all their liberties and moved his capital to the city of York. Again, just like Edward III had done, Edward II, Edward I as well. And he also gave the city of York a charter, where he gave the mayor the power to call petty assizes. Well, what are these? These are his own courts, really. The assizes of ale, the assizes of bread, really to check the quality of the goods being sold in the city. So this is an extension of the mayor's power. He also gave the Lord Mayor, the responsibility to keep the king's peace effectively. The Lord Mayor is now the chief magistrate of the city, responsible only to the king. Really quite important. He also gives the city of York the opportunity to elect their own sheriffs of the city instead of bailiffs, which they had been before. And a year later, he gives the city the cap of maintenance and a mace. These are symbols of the power of the monarch. And what these symbolise, the cap of maintenance, the mace and the sword, is that the mayor, or the Lord Mayor of the city of York, is now the king's representative in the city, the chief magistrate of the city. In 1396, again looking for support against opposition, Richard also brings in the Charter of the City of York, in which he yet again extends the powers of the Lord Mayor of the city. York becomes a county in and of itself and is given control of the Ainsty, the whole of the Ainsty, which is a huge area, and also Ganters Forest as well. So we've got increasing powers of the Lord Mayor of the City of York. The city is also given the right to carry the sword point upright within the bounds of the city walls, except when the monarch comes. And not only does the mayor have a mace bearer who will progress in front of him, as well as a sword bearer, but the sheriffs of York also have their own mace bearers as well. In the 16th century, there are tales of Lord Mayors going around the city naked. However, that did not mean what we think it means. It meant that they went out without their sword bearers and their mace bearers. They weren't properly doing things, in the right way, with this procession, with their mace bearers and their sword bearers. So really quite significant, which is why Richard II features so heavily in the coat of arms that we now see everywhere around the city. Unfortunately, neither his mace, nor his sword, nor his cap of maintenance survived. But the sword of state that is used, and you can still see it, the Mansion House in York, is known as a Sigismund sword. And really, it's thought that it was donated by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who you can see here, looking very fine, with his lovely crown on, and he's wearing an ermine-trimmed robe under a canopy of state, and Sigismund was an ally of Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. And about 1416, a year after Agincourt, Sigismund came into an alliance with Henry V, and he was made a Knight of the Order of the Garter of St. George. And as part of that Order of the Knight of St. George, he had to put his sword above his stall in St. George's Chapel in Windsor. And when he died in 1437, the sword was actually given to the Deans of Windsor Chapel. And it is thought that perhaps one Henry Hanslap bought this sword from the Deans of Windsor and then presented it to the city of York in 1439. Now, we've no evidence for that. The only evidence we have is of another sword that Henry Hanslap bought in 1437 for 6 shillings and 8pence, which doesn't sound a lot, but it would have been hundreds of thousands perhaps, and buying the sword of William Philip, Lord of Bardolph and Lord of the Garter, that's been sold by order of the Dean and Canons of Windsor. Now, if Henry Hanslap bought one sword, he could buy another. And it is thought that it is this same Henry Hanslap that then presented the sword of Sigismund to the city of York. Now, you might think that's quite tenuous, but when you look at the detail of the scabbard, on the scabbard of the sword, the Sigismund sword, can be seen this dragon. And on the back of the dragon, we've got a cross. And this is the symbol of the Order of the Dragon that Sigismund, Holy Roman Emperor, actually started during his reign in Germany. And Henry V was a member of it. Oh, there we go, there they are. I don't know why he's got his eye closed there. But I just thought you'd like to see. This is the reconstruction of the Order of the Dragon that Sigismund set up. And here you can see it being displayed where he's actually wearing it. And although, if I go back here, the scabbard of the Sigismund sword has been repaired many a time, starting in the 16th century, we do have a description of that it was covered with 5 red scorpions, which I think you'll agree with me that would be one way of describing this symbol in the 16th century. So it has been renovated since the 15th century, but it is the same sword, we think, that Sigismund donated to the Chapel of St. George. So we've got then that sort of state. The one that's shown here is the bow sword that was presented to the city of York in the 16th century with a really big jewel at the end there. And this big jewel, when James I visited the city in 1603, he took a liking to this sword with a jewel on the pommel of the sword. And he went to London with James and his entourage. And when the sword came back to the city of York, guess what? The jewel had gone. Now, James I did like to get some brass. So, you know. We've also got here, at the top you can see the old cap of maintenance from 1580, which you can still see in the Mansion House in York, and the city mace. Now, although Richard II had given the city a mace, don't know what happened to that, don't know what happened to the sword that he gave to the city. That disappears in the 1790s. It's on inventories up until that time. But apparently it was much smaller than the sword of Sigismund or the bow sword either. And the mace itself, most of the mace that we see today dates from about 1657, and at the top, after the restoration of Charles II, we have a crown put at the top for Charles II. That's from the 1660s. So when we look at the cap of maintenance then on the coat of arms today, we see a little peaked cap, and you can see it's almost like a Robin Hood cap, but it's almost back to front, because a cap of maintenance, when you see them on heraldic arms for earls and barons and so forth, you can see they're actually the other way around, but with the peaked cap at the back rather than a peaked cap at the front. And before 1915, which is when the King, George V, gave a cap of maintenance to the city in 1915. Before that time, the cap of maintenance had looked like this at the top here, more like a Muscovy hat. So there's been change in the shape of the hat over the centuries. But a cap of maintenance comes from Liverian maintenance. It means that the people who are given these signs and signifiers are the men, are loyal subjects of the king. And they are symbols of the king's power and authority. Power and authority. So when we look though at the coat of arms of the city of York, it tells the history of the city. The cross of St George, I would maintain, is associated with Simon de Montfort and associated with the fact that the city of York wants to show it's loyal to Henry II, and they're done with Simon de Montfort in the late 1260s. And that's why they adopt the red cross of Henry III on the white background. The 5 lions, I think, are adopted during the reign of Edward III, when he was thinking of making York his capital city. Yay! Instead of London. And the cap of maintenance, the mace and the sword of state, really, we remember Richard II. And although the items he gave the city in 1393 and 1389 have long gone, we still have the Sigismund sword of state from about 1415, 16. We have the mace from the 17th century, and we have the cap of maintenance that Queen Elizabeth II donated to the city in 2012, which can still be seen at the Mansion House today. So in the coat of arms, the next time you see it on a bus, remember Simon de Montfort. What's the next one? Yeah, Edward III and Richard II. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you, Gillian, for a fascinating talk as well. Really want to thank you for attending this event. This is not the end of the Festival of Ideas. You have got more opportunities to visit more events the rest of today and over the rest of this week as well. But just before we all go, can we give Gillian a massive round of applause? Thank you very much.